More people died building Germany's most famous secret weapon than were ever killed by it. That is not a claim anyone made at the time, and it is not Allied propaganda. It is a conclusion drawn by the Smithsonian Institution's own curator of space history, applied to a program that consumed resources on the scale of the Manhattan Project. This is the story of the German Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons, and why the most dangerous thing about them was never their destructive power but the industrial catastrophe required to produce them at all. Germany built jet fighters, rocket planes, ballistic missiles, flying submarines, the largest gun ever fired in combat, and a tank so heavy it could not cross most European bridges. Popular history has spent 80 years arguing these weapons came too late, but the better question, the one the evidence actually supports, is whether they were ever going to matter at all. By the spring of 1945, the Mittelwerk underground factory beneath the Harz Mountains had processed roughly 60,000 prisoners, and approximately 20,000 of them died from exhaustion, starvation, exposure, and execution. The weapon those prisoners built, the V-2 ballistic missile, went on to kill approximately 5,000 people in Britain and continental Europe combined. The Smithsonian's Michael Neufeld put it plainly, the V-2 was perhaps the only weapon system in history to have caused more deaths through its production than through its deployment. Germany poured resources approaching the cost of the entire American atomic bomb program into a missile that carried a single one-ton conventional warhead, killed more of its own builders than its targets, and did not shorten the war by a single day. That is the Wunderwaffen story. Not a tale of almost victory. A tale of catastrophic misdirection. To understand how Germany arrived here, you need to understand what the word Wunderwaffe actually meant in context and who was manufacturing that meaning. The term did not come from engineering laboratories. Wunderwaffe and Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon, were coinages of the propaganda ministry, designed to serve a political function, and that origin contaminated every decision made about these weapons from the start. After the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, after the Eastern Front had turned and it had become undeniable to anyone with access to honest maps that the Reich was losing the war of production against three great industrial powers simultaneously, the Nazi leadership needed a narrative. That narrative was, technology will save us, hold on, the miracle is coming. The Vergeltungswaffe designation attached itself to three specific programs, the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile, and the V-3 supergun, but the broader Wunderwaffen mythology enveloped everything from jet fighters to submarine technology to supertanks. It served a political function before it served a military one, and that priority never changed. Albert Speer, sitting at the center of the German war machine as Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production from February 1942 onward, would later write about the V-2 program with barely concealed frustration at his own past decisions. Germany could have deployed the Wasserfall instead, a surface-to-air missile based on similar technology, far cheaper to produce, and potentially capable of seriously degrading the Allied strategic bombing campaign that was dismantling German industry piece by piece. The same engineering knowledge, a fraction of the cost, and a weapon that might actually have changed something. Germany chose the V-2 instead, a terror weapon that delivered 1 ton of explosives at enormous cost with no ability to aim at anything specific. Speer called the entire notion, in essence, absurd. The decision to build the V-2 over the Wasserfall is one of the clearest illustrations in military history of what modern strategic analysts call capability requirement mismatch, the same failure mode that kills modern defense procurement programs. When the U.S. military spent the 1990s developing the F-22 Raptor for air-to-air combat against Soviet fighters, it produced the most expensive and technically advanced jet fighter in history, designed to win a war that had ended before the plane entered service against an enemy that no longer existed. The V-2's problem was structurally identical, a weapon optimized for a strategic concept terrorizing cities into surrender that was never going to work, built at a cost that drained resources from the defenses that might actually have preserved Germany's industrial capacity. Understanding why this kept happening requires understanding how the Nazi state actually made decisions. The Third Reich was not, as it appeared from the outside, a monolithic hierarchy with a single chain of command flowing cleanly from the top. Beneath the surface it ran as a system of competing institutional power centers: the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, the SS, the Navy, the party apparatus, the various ministries, each operating its own fiefdom with its own budget, its own programs, and its own line of access to Hitler's attention. Hitler governed less through systematic administration than through deliberate institutional competition, encouraging his subordinates to fight each other for resources and influence and then adjudicating the results according to his personal preferences and moods. For weapons development, this structure was catastrophic. The V2 was an army project, developed under General Walter Dornberger and Wernher von Braun through the Army Weapons Office. The V1 was a Luftwaffe project. Both programs aimed at bombarding British cities, both ran through Peenemünde for geographic reasons, and both competed for resources in Hitler's favor rather than coordinating, meaning that engineers working on adjacent programs at the same Baltic facility could not freely share insights without navigating inter-service bureaucracy. SS General Hans Kammler then inserted himself into the picture, first taking control of V2 production in 1943, then extending SS oversight to the broader rocket program, and eventually claiming authority over the emergency fighter program and other late-war technology initiatives. By 1945, the same man who had overseen construction of the gas chambers at Auschwitz was directing Germany's most sensitive weapons programs, his authority resting not on technical expertise but on the SS organizational muscle and Himmler's relationship with Hitler. Hitler's personal involvement in weapons decisions consistently pushed things in the wrong direction. The Maus supertank survived as a program because Hitler was captivated by the concept of an impenetrable armored vehicle, and Heinz Guderian, Germany's foremost tank warfare theorist, Inspector General of Armored Troops from 1943, repeatedly tried to cancel it and was repeatedly overruled. The Schwerer Gustav railway gun was Hitler's vision of the ultimate artillery piece, designed for a strategic situation that had ceased to be relevant before the gun ever fired a combat round. The Me-262 jet fighter's deployment as a bomber was Hitler's personal preference, maintained over Adolf Galland's sustained objections through months of institutional conflict that consumed the energy of senior Luftwaffe commanders at exactly the moment that energy was needed elsewhere. Speer was supposed to rationalize this system. His mandate as armaments minister included imposing order on the chaos of German war production, and he did achieve genuine organizational improvements. Armaments output increased substantially through 1943 and into 1944. But rationalizing weapons development priorities was beyond his reach, because those decisions flowed from Hitler, and Speer's access to Hitler depended on maintaining the Führer's confidence. Arguing consistently for canceling Hitler's favorite projects was not a strategy that extended careers in the Third Reich. The institutional chaos meant that the same strategic mistake, building expensive, complex, low-quantity systems instead of cheaper, simpler, higher-quantity ones, repeated itself across every branch of the military simultaneously, with no one at the top capable of imposing a corrective principle. The V2 program is where the mythology begins, and it is where the evidence against that mythology is most damning. Designated the A4 in its developmental phase, A for aggregate, meaning assembly, the V2 was the world's first practical long-range ballistic missile and the first human-made object to reach the boundary of space. Burning a mixture of 75% ethanol and 25% water as fuel combined with liquid oxygen, it accelerated to supersonic velocity within seconds of launch, and once airborne there was no defense against it. No anti-aircraft gun could track it. No fighter aircraft could intercept it. Arriving faster than sound, it hit before anyone on the ground heard it coming, which meant the V2 killed without any possibility of warning or escape. Wernher von Braun built it. A German engineer obsessed with space travel since adolescence, von Braun joined the SS in 1940 and would later go on to direct the American Saturn V rocket program that landed humans on the moon. His military supervisor at Peenemünde, the isolated research installation on Germany's Baltic coast, was General Walter Dornberger, and the two men had worked together since the early 1930s, developing a rocket that began as a legitimate scientific project and became, as the war escalated, an instrument of state terror. In March 1944, the Gestapo briefly arrested von Braun on the charge that he had been overheard expressing private doubts about the military application of his work, suggesting he was more interested in space travel than weapons. Himmler had been looking for a foothold over the rocket program, and this gave him a pretext. Dornberger convinced the regime that the V2 could not be completed without von Braun, and after a few weeks he was released, but the arrest had made its point. After that, von Braun did not speak carelessly about his reservations. What happened next at Peenemünde is where the Wunderwaffen's true cost becomes visible. On the night of August 17 to 18, 1943, the RAF bombed Peenemünde in Operation Hydra, killing a number of key personnel including the chief propulsion engineer Dr. Walter Thiel and damaging facilities significantly. British bombs also fell on the Trassenheit forced labor camp adjacent to the installation, killing hundreds of enslaved workers. The rocket program then relocated to the Mittelwerk, a network of tunnels bored into the limestone of the Kohnstein Ridge near Nordhausen, and it brought its labor model with it. The man who built Mittelwerk was SS General Hans Kammler, the same man who had overseen construction of the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Two parallel main tunnels, each roughly 180 meters long, were connected by 46 cross-tunnels driven through the rock, and in those tunnels, under fluorescent lighting, breathing limestone dust and rocket fuel residue, prisoners drawn from the Dora subcamp of Buchenwald assembled the components of the A4. In the early months there were no barracks, prisoners slept in tiered wooden bunks carved into the tunnel walls, sanitation was minimal, and tuberculosis moved through the population at rates that killed people within weeks of arrival. Those who could no longer work were separated from the others and allowed to die, or executed. At Woolworths in New Cross, South London, on November 25, 1944, a single V2 impact killed 168 people, the deadliest strike of the entire campaign. Those deaths were real, and the terror created by V2 attacks was psychologically distinct from anything Britain had previously experienced. No sirens, no warning, no moment to take shelter, just the impact and then the sound arriving afterward. Against those 168 deaths in a single strike, and roughly 5,000 across the entire British campaign, set the approximately 20,000 people who died in the tunnels producing these missiles. The weapon killed its builders at 4 times the rate it killed its targets. Neufeld's research established that von Braun visited Mittelwerk repeatedly during production and would have seen the conditions firsthand. His post-war description of them was repulsive, a word chosen, some historians have noted, with evident care. Not criminal. Not unconscionable. Repulsive, the kind of word that acknowledges discomfort without acknowledging culpability. At least one wartime letter directly implicates von Braun in decisions about slave labor use, and Arthur Rudolph, the chief production engineer at Mittelwerk, had explicitly endorsed concentration camp prisoner labor as far back as April 1943. Between 20,000 and 25,000 people died at Mittelbau-Dora and across the wider V2 production network. Neufeld attributed at least 10,000 deaths to the Mittelwerk program specifically and up to another 10,000 across the broader rocket production system. The summary from the Imperial War Museum and BBC documentary research puts it plainly: more slave laborers died making the V-weapons than the civilians killed by them. Now set all of that against what the program cost in material terms. Each V2 required between 7,500 and 20,000 man-hours of labor to build, with per-unit production cost ranging from roughly 75,000 to 100,000 Reichsmarks depending on the production phase. The program consumed approximately one-third of Germany's entire fuel alcohol production, ethanol, that should have been going into aircraft fuel, or simply into keeping the population fed. Across all development and production, the total cost of Germany's V-weapons program has been estimated at roughly 2 billion Reichsmarks, an industrial effort comparable in scope to the American Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project produced the atomic bomb. The V2 program produced a weapon that delivered a single ton of conventional explosives to a city with no ability to aim at military targets. Freeman Dyson analyzed German weapons programs for RAF Bomber Command during the war and later described the V2 with a precision that has never been improved upon. Each V2 cost the Germans at least as much in skilled labor and materials as a modern fighter aircraft, which meant Germany was effectively destroying its own air force capacity to build rockets. Dyson concluded that the V2 program's net effect on German warfighting capacity was nearly equivalent to a policy of voluntary disarmament. The V1 flying bomb was a different kind of weapon, and in some respects a more rational one. A single V1 cost roughly 1,250 Reichsmarks, less than 5% of a V2, and it was the world's first operational cruise missile, developed at Piedmont under the cover name Flak-Ciel 76 and carrying roughly 850 kilograms to 1 ton of explosive across a range of approximately 240 kilometers. Unlike the V2, it was slow enough at cruise altitude to be intercepted, which proved consequential. Nearly 30,000 V1s were built in total, with approximately 9,521 launched against Britain. Of those, somewhere between 2,419 and 2,515 reached London, the rest were shot down, crashed from mechanical failure, or were spoofed off course by British double agents feeding false targeting data back to German handlers. The campaign ran from June 13, 1944, when the first struck Bethnal Green, through October 1944, when Allied ground forces overran the French launch sites, with a further 2,448 V1 subsequently fired at the Belgian port of Antwerp through March 1945. The strikes killed approximately 6,184 people in Britain and injured roughly 17,981 more, causing genuine panic. More than 1 million people left London during the campaign, and Churchill considered the option of retaliating with poison gas. The British defensive response, though, was more effective than German planners had anticipated. Barrage balloons over London, concentrated anti-aircraft gunbelts along the coast, and fighter interception by fast aircraft like the Hawker Tempest and the Griffin engine Spitfire 14 combined to shoot down roughly 55% of all V1s launched against Britain by the end of August 1944, with the interception rate climbing dramatically as defenders refined their tactics. The V1 was not a weapon against which there was no defense. Operation Crossbow, the Allied campaign against weapon infrastructure, consumed up to 40% of British bombing sorties at its peak and over 25% of the combined bomber offensive's total tonnage during July and August 1944. Some historians have argued this represents a genuine German strategic success, the weapons forced a diversion of Allied air power. But examine what that diversion actually cost Germany in return: a V2 program consuming Manhattan Project-scale resources, killing 20,000 of its own builders, and drawing down a third of Germany's fuel alcohol production. The Allied diversion was real. Germany's self-inflicted damage was greater. The V3 supergun, the third of the Virgil-Tungswaff trio, did not even achieve the modest results of the V1. Officially called the Hochdruck pump, high-pressure pump, the V3 used sequential propellant charges along a barrel approximately 130 meters long to accelerate projectiles to the velocity required to travel roughly 165 kilometers. 5 barrels were to be embedded in tunnels bored through the chalk at Mimoyex and the Pas-de-Calais, angled permanently toward London. On July 6, 1944, before a single round had been fired at Britain, RAF 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, dropped Tallboy deep penetration bombs on the site, driving through the chalk and collapsing the tunnels. The V3 supergun never fired on London. There is a tragic footnote to this. On August 12, 1944, the United States launched Operation Anvil in an attempt to destroy the Mimoyex site using radio-controlled aircraft packed with explosives. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., the eldest Kennedy son, the man his family expected would one day be president, was assigned to arm the aircraft before bailing out. Kennedy armed the explosives, turned control over to the radio operators, and prepared to jump. The aircraft exploded prematurely, killing Kennedy and his co-pilot. The target they died trying to destroy had already been wrecked by the Tallboys weeks earlier. A shorter, field-deployed version of the V3 did eventually fire, sending 183 rounds at Luxembourg between December 30, 1944 and February 22, 1945, killing approximately 10 civilians. While the rocket programs were consuming German resources on a continental scale, the Luftwaffe was fighting a parallel technological war in the air and losing it in ways that the Wunderwaffen mythology has consistently distorted. The Messerschmitt Me 262 became the most mythologized German weapon of the entire war. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, flying roughly 160 km per hour faster than any Allied piston-engine aircraft it encountered, with 4 30mm cannon capable of tearing apart a heavy bomber in a single firing pass. Pilots who flew against it described the experience as encountering something from a different era, which, technologically speaking, was accurate. Between 1,400 and 1,443 Mi-262s were built before Germany's surrender, with Allied claims crediting the type with roughly 542 aircraft destroyed, though cross-checking those claims against confirmed combat records puts the actual figure closer to 150 Allied kills against approximately 100 Mi-262s lost in air combat. Now comes the claim that has dominated the mythology for 80 years, that Hitler personally wrecked the Mi-262 by ordering it converted into a bomber, delaying its introduction as a fighter and costing Germany the air war it might otherwise have won. General Adolf Galland, who commanded Germany's fighter forces and built much of his post-war reputation on this argument, stated in interviews as late as 1994 that with just 300 Mi-262 jet fighters Germany could have shot down a minimum of 200 Allied bombers per day, and if that rate had continued for even 2 weeks, the Allied daytime bombing campaign would have been forced to halt. Galland called the bomber decision a typical Hitler error. The United States National Archives and the Smithsonian Institution's own object record for the Mi-262 tell a different story. Yes, Hitler ordered that the aircraft be employed primarily as a bomber at a conference between May 23 and 27, 1944, at Berchtesgaden, diverting approximately 30% of production airframes to the Mi-262A to a Sturmvogel bomber variant. But the fundamental bottleneck was never that order. The fundamental bottleneck was the Junkers Jumo 004 jet engine. Germany lacked sufficient quantities of nickel, cobalt, and molybdenum, the heat-resistant alloys required to build turbine blades that could withstand operational temperatures without failing, and the Jumo 004 that went into production was an inferior version of the original design, built from substitute materials with an operational life of approximately 25 hours before requiring complete overhaul. Pilots were instructed never to move the throttle quickly because the engines would flame out. The aircraft was a miracle of aerodynamics hobbled by material reality, and the Smithsonian's assessment is unambiguous. The jet could not have been deployed in large numbers before late 1944 regardless of the bomber order. Hitler's interference was real. It was not decisive. Kommando Nowotny, named for the Austrian ace Walter Nowotny who commanded it, began operations on October 3, 1944, and Nowotny himself was shot down and killed on November 8, most likely by American P-51 Mustangs that caught him while his engines were malfunctioning on approach to land. Allied fighter commanders had worked out the solution quickly. The Mi-262 was uncatchable in level flight or from behind, but interceptable in the landing pattern, where a jet running low on fuel approached an airfield at reduced power and was no faster than a piston aircraft. The Germans responded by placing conventional fighter cover over jet bases during recovery operations, which consumed additional resources and complicated operations further. JG-7 Hindenburg, the primary Mi-262 jet fighter unit formed in late 1944, came closest to the vision Galland had described. On March 18, 1945, JG-7 launched 37 Mi-262s against a formation of 1,221 Allied bombers escorted by 632 fighters, and German records credit the unit with 12 bombers and 1 fighter destroyed against the loss of 3 Mi-262s, the largest jet fighter engagement of the war. Consider the mathematics: 37 aircraft attacking a force of nearly 2,000, achieving results that were tactically notable and strategically irrelevant. The bombers continued to their targets. The war continued. Galland's own JV-44, the squadron of experts formed in early 1945 and stocked with Germany's top surviving aces, was the final experiment in the Mi-262 as a war winner. JV-44 flew combat operations for approximately 6 weeks before the war ended, achieved genuine kills against Allied bombers, then ran out of fuel, watched its airfields get strafed by Allied aircraft, and saw Galland himself wounded in action. Of the 1,400 plus Mi-262s built, only approximately 200 were ever operational at any given moment, with a maximum daily sortie rate of roughly 60. Germany's synthetic fuel plants had been devastated by Allied bombing, and aircraft were being built faster than the country could fuel them or train pilots to fly them. The Messerschmitt Mi-163 Comet makes the Mi-262's problems look modest. The Comet was the only rocket-powered fighter to enter operational service in history, burning two hypergolic propellants, T-STOF, a concentrated hydrogen peroxide compound, and C-STOF, a methanol hydrazine mixture, that were violently corrosive to human tissue. Alexander Lippisch, who designed the aircraft's aerodynamic lineage, reportedly observed that contact with T-STOF would leave a pilot with only bone. Fuel system leaks were not a theoretical risk. Pilots died from contact with the propellants, died when the aircraft shattered on landing via its wheel-Dalianskid system, and died when residual propellants combined in crash wreckage and exploded. Approximately 370 Mi-163s were built, achieving roughly 9 confirmed kills against Allied aircraft while losing approximately 10 of their own in air combat and at least 9 pilots to accidents. The aircraft carried 7 to 8 minutes of powered flight, giving pilots approximately 2.5 seconds of firing opportunity on each pass, meaning the very speed that made the Comet impossible to intercept also made it nearly impossible for its own pilots to aim accurately. The Heinkel He-162 Volksjager adds a layer of institutional absurdity that is almost incomprehensible in retrospect. In September 1944, the Reich Air Ministry issued a specification for an emergency jet fighter to be built quickly from non-strategic materials, specifically wood, and flown by minimally trained Hitler Youth teenagers, on the theory that young men already trained on gliders could transition directly to jet-powered combat aircraft. Ernst Heinkel's firm won the contract. The first He-162 flew on December 6, 1944, and 4 days later the prototype crashed from an aileron failure caused by the wood glue adhesive dissolving under operational stresses. The acidic adhesive used to bond the wooden airframe was eating through it. By war's end, nearly 1,000 He-162s were on assembly lines, but only between 116 and 120 had been delivered to the Luftwaffe, most of which never flew in combat, no fuel, no trained pilots, no coherent deployment plan. JG-1, the unit that did operate the He-162, lost approximately 13 aircraft and 9 to 10 pilots in just 3 weeks, primarily to accidents. Ernst Heinkel himself later described the concept of having Hitler Youth fly this aircraft as displaying the unbalanced fanaticism of those days. The engineer who built the aircraft was telling anyone who would listen that it should not have been built. While Germany was building aircraft it could not fuel, man, or deploy, on the ground it was building armor it could not replace. The Tiger I heavy tank entered service in 1942, carrying the 88mm gun that could penetrate the armor of any Allied or Soviet tank at standard combat ranges, while the Tiger I's own frontal armor resisted most contemporary anti-tank rounds. In tank versus tank engagements on favorable terrain, the Tiger I genuinely dominated. SS Heavy Panzer Battalion 101, operating in Normandy in 1944, destroyed over 130 Allied tanks and armored vehicles while losing fewer than a dozen of its own Tigers over approximately 3 months of operations. Those kill ratios were real, not propaganda, and they were completely irrelevant to the outcome of the war. A Tiger I cost approximately 250,000 Reichsmarks per unit against roughly 103,500 Reichsmarks for a Panzer IV, consumed enough steel to build approximately 21 105mm howitzers, and required approximately 300,000 man-hours to produce, and across the entire war, 1,347 Tiger Is were completed. By 1944, the Soviet Union was producing T-34s at approximately 1,200 per month, and the United States was producing M4 Shermans at comparable monthly rates. Germany's total Tiger I production across the entire war was 1,347 vehicles, not per month, total. At a 10-to-1 kill ratio, Tiger I battalions would need to destroy 13,470 tanks to eliminate their own production, and Soviet monthly output at the 1944 rate would replace that loss in approximately 11 months. Germany would have expended its entire Tiger I inventory in the process. The Tigers were killing enemy tanks faster than any conventional unit in history and losing the production war so badly that none of it mattered. The Tiger II was worse in almost every logistical dimension. Only 492 King Tigers were built, one completed in 1943, 379 in 1944, and 112 in the war's final months at approximately 321,500 Reichsmarks each, with a suspension frequently strained to failure by the vehicle's own weight and an engine that broke down regularly on anything other than hard, flat roads. The Panther, meanwhile, illustrates the self-inflicted damage of rushing complex systems into combat before they are ready. Committed to the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 over the objections of officers who understood the design was not production mature, the Panther OSV suffered from fuel system fires, gearbox failures, and steering mechanism breakdowns at catastrophic rates. A large share of the roughly 200 initially deployed lost to mechanical breakdown before ever engaging Soviet armor. German ordnance officers had warned explicitly that the Panther needed more developmental time. Production schedules driven by the insistence on having the tank available for Kursk overrode that judgment. Adam Tooze's economic history of the Nazi war machine reaches the unavoidable conclusion: Germany never possessed the resource base to win a war of production against three industrial great powers, and the decision to build expensive, logistically demanding heavy tanks instead of larger numbers of simpler, more reliable vehicles was a symptom of that fundamental structural problem, not a solution to it. The Panzer VIII Maus represents the Wunderwaffen philosophy distilled to its purest and most absurd expression. Weighing between 188 and 207 tons, the heaviest armored vehicle ever built, it mounted a 128mm gun capable of destroying any Allied or Soviet tank at combat ranges, carried armor impervious to essentially any direct-fire weapon the Allies could bring against it, and moved at a maximum of approximately 22 km/h on hard roads. The Maus was too heavy to cross most European bridges. The planned solution was that it would ford rivers by snorkeling, submerging to the riverbed and driving across the bottom, supplied with air through a tube connected to another Maus on the surface, and this was the intended tactical deployment doctrine for a vehicle meant to lead offensive operations. 5 were ordered, 2 were built. The war ended before deployment. Soviet forces captured both incomplete prototypes at the Kummersdorf testing ground, combined the components of the two into one composite vehicle, and that vehicle sits today at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. The Maus never fired a shot at an enemy. The Schwerer Gustav was the largest caliber rifled gun ever used in combat, with a barrel 80 centimeters (31.5 inches) in diameter, firing shells weighing approximately 4,800 to 7,100 kilograms at targets up to 39 kilometers away. Designed specifically to defeat the Maginot Line, the Gustav arrived after Germany had bypassed that line entirely through Belgium and Luxembourg in May 1940, rendering its primary strategic purpose obsolete before the weapon ever fired in that intended role. Deploying it required approximately 2,500 personnel for security, logistics, and operation, plus a crew of approximately 250, plus engineers to lay special railway track and construct a prepared firing emplacement, all of which allowed a maximum rate of approximately 1 round per hour. At Sevastopol in the summer of 1942, the Gustav fired approximately 48 rounds and destroyed an underground Soviet ammunition magazine beneath Severnaya Bay that conventional artillery genuinely could not reach, the weapon's single legitimate tactical success in its entire operational history. After Sevastopol, the Gustav was transported with enormous logistical effort toward Leningrad, where no appropriate siege materialized, then toward the Eastern Front more broadly, then back westward as the war reversed. A second gun, Dora, was built. Both were destroyed to prevent capture, the Dora around April 19, 1945. 2 of history's largest guns, one confirmed engagement where the weapon achieved something proportionate to its cost, and an entire logistical apparatus consuming resources for years to deliver a single meaningful result. Under the Baltic, Germany was building submarines that represented the most genuinely revolutionary technology of the entire Wunderwaffen program and demonstrating, in doing so, the fundamental timing problem that defined everything else. The Type XXI U-boat, the Elektroboot, was designed from 1943 onward to fight the Battle of the Atlantic in a completely different way from anything that had come before. Previous U-boats, including the Type 7 that had devastated Allied shipping in the early war years, were primarily surface vessels that submerged when threatened, needing to surface regularly to run their diesel engines, recharge batteries, and ventilate. By 1943, Allied air coverage over the mid-Atlantic gap had closed, radar technology had advanced dramatically, and aircraft equipped with Lee lights were hunting U-boats at night with devastating effectiveness, making surface running catastrophically dangerous. The Type XXI answered these problems directly to triple the battery capacity of the Type 7, a snorkel allowing the diesel engines to run while the boat remained just below the surface, and underwater speeds substantially exceeding what Allied detection systems were designed to handle. A properly deployed fleet of Type XXI U-boats could theoretically have reinstated the German submarine threat at a point when the Allies believed they had permanently solved it. 118 Type XXI U-boats were commissioned by the war's end against a production target of 1,500 at 3 per week. Of those 118, only 4 were combat-ready when Germany surrendered, and only 2 U-2511 and U-3008 ever conducted war patrols. Neither fired a torpedo at an enemy vessel. The reason the Type XXI failed even as a manufacturing exercise reveals the Nazi system's dysfunction extending into programs representing genuine breakthroughs. Albert Speer's decision to apply automobile industry mass production logic to submarine construction meant that prefabricated sections were built at inland factories with no experience in pressure hull construction, where tolerances acceptable for automobiles proved inadequate for vessels designed to operate at depth. Sections arrived at coastal assembly yards that did not fit properly together, welding quality was inadequate, and completed boats showed structural deficiencies requiring correction before they could operate safely. The safe diving depth of production Type XXI boats was demonstrably less than the older types they were meant to replace. The revolutionary design had been mass-produced into mediocrity. Commander Adalbert Schnee took U-2511 on its sole patrol on May 3, 1945, 4 days before Germany's final surrender, encountered Allied shipping, and did not fire. Germany surrendered on May 7, and U-2511 returned to port without engaging any target. The post-war legacy of the Type XXI, though, was enormous. The United States Guppy program, the British Porpoise class, the Soviet Whiskey and Zulu classes all drew on the Type XXI's conceptual foundation. The revolution was real. It arrived 3 years after it could have changed anything. The Sturmgewehr 44 is the Wunderwaffen program's most intellectually honest entry. It was genuinely what it claimed to be, the world's first mass-produced assault rifle, designed by Hugo Schmeisser at CG Hanel, firing the 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz intermediate cartridge that bridged the gap between submachine gun and rifle performance. The concept was sound, the execution competent, and the weapon worked. Approximately 425,977 were produced. The design influenced the AK-47 and through that weapon essentially every assault rifle in use today. And the very word Sturmgewehr, assault rifle, reportedly coined by Hitler himself for propaganda purposes when he authorized production he had previously tried to suppress, entered the military vocabulary of every army in the world because of it. But 425,977 units arriving in the final years of a war Germany was losing comprehensively were too few, distributed across too vast a front, to change the fundamental equation. The Bakhemba 349 Natter Viper is the Wunderwaffen program's darkest footnote, and in a certain light its most honest symbol. Himmler championed the concept after Erich Bachem proposed it in 1944, a manned surface-to-air missile. Essentially, vertically launched from a simple wooden tower on a Walter rocket engine augmented by solid fuel boosters, guided by a pilot toward Allied bomber formations to fire an unguided rocket salvo, after which both the pilot and the aircraft would descend separately by parachute. The Natter was built primarily from wood, requiring approximately 1,000 man-hours per aircraft, with the SS ordering 150 and the Luftwaffe ordering 50, and approximately 36 were actually completed. 17 unmanned vertical test launches were conducted before the program attempted a manned flight. On March 1, 1945, at Heuberg, test pilot Lothar Sieber strapped in for the first man launch, and the canopy, not properly secured, tore away during the initial acceleration. The Natter continued climbing under rocket power, rolled over, and dove into the ground. Sieber was killed. The program continued anyway. 10 aircraft were subsequently deployed to Kirchheim under Teck in preparation for operations against Allied bombers, and before they could be used, American ground forces advanced into the area. The aircraft were destroyed to prevent capture, and the Natter never engaged a single Allied aircraft. Every 1,000 man-hour Natter represented a skilled worker who was not building a conventional fighter aircraft, not maintaining operational Focke-Wulf FW-190s, not constructing the air defenses Germany actually needed, and the opportunity cost of that diverted labor, multiplied across every Wonder Weapon program, was measured in German defensive capability that was not built. The Horten Ho 229 has acquired a modern mythology as the world's first stealth aircraft, a framing that Smithsonian conservators have substantially dismantled. Examining the surviving prototype and analyzing coating samples from the airframe, they found no evidence of intentional radar-absorbing design. The Horten brothers wanted a fast, efficient fighter to meet Hermann Göring's requirement to carry 1,000 kilograms at 1,000 kilometers per hour across 1,000 kilometers. The radar-reduced cross-section was an incidental consequence of the flying wing aerodynamics, not a deliberate stealth feature. The V-3 prototype, the first jet-equipped version, never flew. The A9/A10 America Rocket, a proposed two-stage intercontinental rocket intended to strike New York City, never progressed beyond preliminary designs and test components. The Sun Gun, based on Hermann Oberth's 1929 orbital mirror concept, would have required a roughly 9 square kilometer sodium mirror placed at an altitude of approximately 8,200 kilometers, and the engineering required to place any structure of that kind in orbit was approximately 50 to 100 years beyond what 1940s technology could achieve. These projects consumed engineering attention and institutional energy. Scientists whose careers depended on their program's survival had every incentive to pursue the most ambitious possible versions of their concepts. The competing institutional power centers each sponsored programs partly to expand their own influence, and the Wonder Weapons were as much political objects as military ones. One of the most revealing aspects of the entire Wunderwaffen story is the Allied intelligence response, because it tells you precisely how seriously the weapons threat was assessed by professionals whose survival depended on getting that assessment right. R.V. Jones, the head of British scientific intelligence, ran a sustained effort throughout 1942 and 1943 to establish whether the German long-range rocket was real, what its capabilities were, and how Germany intended to deploy it. Aerial reconnaissance of Peenemünde beginning in 1942 eventually produced photographic evidence that Jones interpreted correctly. He identified the V-2 in outdoor test areas months before his superiors fully accepted the rocket as real. The Peenemünde raid in August 1943 was, in part, a product of Jones's intelligence effort, representing the largest raid yet directed against a specific weapons development facility. And what the subsequent intelligence history reveals is this: the British, having bombed Peenemünde and continued watching the V-weapon program with the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus available to any nation at the time, never concluded that the V-2 was a war-winning weapon. When V-2 strikes began in September 1944, the British government initially refused to acknowledge that rockets were falling at all, attributing early impacts to gas main explosions to prevent panic and deny Germany confirmation of accuracy. That was sensible communications management. It was not the response of a government that believed the V-2 was going to change the war's outcome. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey analyzed the German war economy comprehensively after Germany's surrender and reached a blunt conclusion: the military effect of the V-weapons was disproportionate to their cost, and the resources Germany invested in them would have produced substantially greater military value if directed toward conventional air defense. The Allied intelligence community reached the same conclusion as the post-war historians, that the Wunderwaffen were not war winners, and reached it in real time, while the war was still being fought. The specific stories of what happened to Germany's engineering talent after May 1945 trace the Wunderwaffen's post-war legacy with an uncomfortable precision. Wernher von Braun surrendered to American forces in early May 1945, having spent the war's final weeks trying to ensure his team was captured by Americans rather than Soviets. Operation Paperclip brought at least 1,000 German and Austrian technical specialists to the United States. Von Braun's rocket group constituted roughly 20% of that number, and von Braun went on to direct the development of the Redstone missile, the Jupiter rocket, and ultimately the Saturn V, the launch vehicle that carried Apollo astronauts to the Moon in July 1969. Von Braun directed NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and became the public face of the American space program in the 1950s and 1960s, appearing on television with Walt Disney and writing books for children about the future of space exploration. The public narrative that developed around him emphasized the visionary engineer who had always really wanted to go to the moon and had been forced by circumstances to work on weapons, a man whose true aspiration had always been the stars. Tom Lehrer captured the moral reality more accurately in 1965, "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down?" "That's not my department," says Wernher von Braun. Von Braun's SS membership had been classified by the US government under Operation Paperclip. His visits to Mittelwerk were known to American officials but not publicized. Arthur Rudolph, who had done more than von Braun to implement the slave labor system and whose wartime endorsement of concentration camp prisoner labor was explicit, worked for NASA through the development of the Saturn V and received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal in 1969, and was not formally investigated until the early 1980s, when proceedings led to his renouncing American citizenship in 1984 rather than face war crimes prosecution. The satellite the Soviets launched in October 1957, Sputnik rode an R-7 rocket designed by Sergei Korolev, built on a foundation of V-2 technology, captured German components, German engineers who had gone east rather than west, and the synthesis that Korolev's team constructed from all of those inputs. Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth in April 1961 on a vehicle descending from the same lineage. Both of the 20th century's great space achievements, American and Soviet, traced directly back to Piemont and from there to Mittelbau-Dora and to the 20,000 people who died in the tunnels of the Harz Mountains. NASA's own official biography of von Braun now states plainly that his story is not simple, acknowledging his SS membership, the forced labor of Mittelwerk, and what it describes as the difficult duality of his contributions and his moral position. That duality runs through the entire Wunderwaffen story. The Me-262 shaped post-war jet aviation. The Type XXI transformed submarine doctrine for every major naval power. The STG-44 defined the assault rifle category that dominates infantry weapons to this day. Surviving examples are distributed across museums on both sides of the Atlantic. Approximately 9 Me-262s survive, including one at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. The sole surviving mouse sits at Kubinka, U-2540. The one operational Type XXI is preserved as the vessel Wilhelm Bauer at the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, and two Backham Natters exist, one restored at the Deutsches Museum in Munich, one in Smithsonian storage. The V3 site at Mimoyex in France is a museum. The memorial at Mittelbau-Dora, on the site of the concentration camp outside Nordhausen, has received visitors since the 1960s and was formally designated a national memorial by the German government. These two sites, the engineering ambition and the human cost, sit a few hundred kilometers apart in northwestern Europe, neither comprehensible without the other. The Wunderwaffen mythology has never really gone away. It lives in video games where the mouse rolls onto the battlefield and the Ho-229 radar evades its way to victory, in alternate history novels, in the endlessly seductive what if that impressive technology invites. The Me-262 really was a revolutionary aircraft. The V-2 really did reach space before anything else human beings had built. The Type XXI really was a submarine ahead of its time. But technically impressive and strategically decisive are not the same thing, and the mythology has spent 80 years conflating them. The Wunderwaffen failure maps precisely onto a well-documented pattern in modern organizational strategy that analysts call innovation theater, the pursuit of high visibility, high complexity projects that generate prestige and internal political capital while consuming resources that would produce better returns invested in fundamentals. The German arms industry in 1943 to 1945 operated as a system in which the actors with the most to gain from spectacular projects, engineers whose programs could not be cancelled, SS officials who ran production empires, party ideologues who needed miracle weapon propaganda, systematically outcompete the actors arguing for simpler, more producible, more operationally effective solutions. The difference between innovation theater in a corporation and innovation theater in a total war is the cost of failure. In a corporation, failed prestige projects mean wasted budgets and missed quarters. In Germany between 1943 and 1945, they meant 20,000 dead slave laborers in a cave factory in the Harz Mountains, 5,000 civilians killed by a missile that cost more than it achieved, and a Luftwaffe that ran out of fuel to fly its own jets before those jets could defend its own airspace. Michael Neufeld's verdict stands as the most precise statement of the historical reality. The wonder weapons were all too premature and flawed to have any decisive impact on the war's outcome. They did not arrive too late. They were conceived in a regime that had already lost the material contest, developed through a procurement system so distorted by institutional rivalry and personal obsessions that it could not efficiently translate engineering talent into deployed capability, produced using slave labor at a human cost that remains appalling 8 decades later, and deployed in numbers and at a stage of the war when no weapon short of an atomic device could have changed the outcome. The deeper question is not whether the Wunderwaffen came too late. The deeper question is what kind of state produces wonder weapons when it is losing a war of production. A rational state facing Germany's situation in 1943 would have concentrated its remaining resources on the most cost-effective defensive capabilities available: more conventional fighters, better air defense, more reliable armor. Some German professionals were arguing exactly that: Speer on the Wasserfall, Galland on concentrating fighter resources, ordnance officers on the tank question. They were overruled, consistently, by an institutional structure that rewarded spectacle over utility. The wonder weapons were not a German military strategy. They were a German political symptom. The V2 tells you more about the Nazi system than about German engineering. It tells you that a state can simultaneously produce one of the greatest technological achievements in human history and commit systematic atrocities to do it, that technical ambition and strategic rationality are not the same thing, and that the story of a weapon is never simply the story of what it can do, it is also the story of what it cost, who paid that cost, and whether anyone at the time was willing to look honestly at the arithmetic. 20,000 people died in the Harz Mountains making a missile that killed 5,000 people on the other side of the English Channel. Freeman Dyson concluded that the entire V2 effort was nearly equivalent to Germany voluntarily disarming itself, and Dyson was right. The wonder weapons did not almost win the war for Germany. They helped lose it, consuming resources, killing their own builders, diverting from real defensive needs, and delivering to the Allied powers the engineers who would go on to define the space age. That is the story the mythology does not tell. That is what the wonder weapons actually were.